Okay, welcome everyone. This is yet another in a series of presentations that Colorado 9/11 Truth has been hosting. We have been in a mode of doing, speakers in auditoriums in the past, but now that it's in the COVID year, we've gotten into doing it by Zoom, and we've gotten actually a lot more scope in who we can bring in this way, people who wouldn't normally travel to Denver. So today we have Matt Campbell. And are you actually in London or near London, Matt?
I'm about 50, 60 miles south of London on the coast, near the coast.
Okay. So Matt is a brother of one of the victims in the North Tower. I have a little bio thing here. I'm just going to read until it gets too boring. If it gets too, it's a little bit lengthy, but I might cut it off at some point and let Matt just fill in the details here. But I'm going to start off. It says, Matt Campbell, brother of Geoffrey Campbell, a UK citizen who died in the North Tower of the WTC on 9/11. The first inquest, Matt had an inquest in his brother's death, and he'll talk about that a little bit today. And there's going to be a second hearing on this, and he can fill us in on how that's coming along. And it says, Mr. Campbell's family believes that the substantial evidence that was not considered at the first inquest overwhelmingly leads to the conclusion that the destruction of the three World Trade Center buildings was caused by explosives. Okay, let me start by asking Matt to just start in and tell us a little bit about Geoff and how he got involved in this whole business of trying to open up the whole 9/11 inquiry by having an appeal from a family member like this, and how that has worked out. Okay.
Okay, thanks, David. Yeah, my brother, he didn't work in the World Trade Center, and if it wasn't for the fact that he was really there doing, it was a conference he was at on the 106th floor of the North Tower. It's a conference organised by Risk Waters, who a British company, and it's one of those conferences, I guess, where you network, and I think they're probably selling products. My brother works in an area of risk management, and he was kind of a project manager working for Reuters. So his normal place of work was, I guess, up in Midtown, Times Square. And he had gone there basically to do some networking because we were looking at him opening up the sort of New York office of my software company. I had a company that was about 20 strong, and we had a fair few clients in the States, and we thought it'd be a good opportunity to get my brother, who's very knowledgeable in the overlap in the area that I worked in, to basically be that key person over there. So, which is, I guess, hard for me to deal with, the fact that he was only there because of what we were planning to do, business-wise, because I said he wouldn't have normally been there. That morning, he was running late. I didn't get it on the day, but I picked it up a couple of days later. He'd sent an email at about 2 minutes past 8, basically saying he was running late for the Risk Waters conference. My co-director had been copied in on that, so he knew that he was heading down there. For a long time, we kind of hoped that, I say a long time, we're talking hours and then days, and certainly within a week, it was all hope had been lost. But we'd hoped that perhaps he hadn't managed to make it down there, and perhaps he'd been injured and was knocked unconscious in a coma somewhere, whatever those sort of things run through your mind. But then we sort of figured it out. No, he had enough time to get up there before the plane impacted at 8:46. So we were actually on holiday in Lanzarote, which is an island in the Canary Islands. I'd been there for a week with my family, and my mum had actually flown out the day before. and she'd spoken to Geoff on the Sunday. Yeah, so it was all very chaotic. I'm sure people have told similar stories, whether they had someone they knew get injured or die there, but it was chaotic. We were trapped over there, couldn't fly for a couple of days. We had a very fuzzy, it probably was something like CNN, cable networked news at this hotel. Couldn't really make out what was going on, and it wasn't really, obviously called people in the UK and my brother's fiance who lived in New York. But it wasn't really until we got back to the UK Thursday night did we kind of just start looking at papers, and just obviously it was everywhere over the news and stuff. And anyway, so my brother was there, and I'm not, David, I'm not really going to go into my sort of journey right now, but I just want to quickly jump in about the inquest.
Okay.
And so my brother was one of 10 people who were British who died in the Wristwaters conference. And when someone dies in the UK, whether it be a murder or suspicious circumstances, whether it be in the UK or abroad, we have what's called an inquest. It's not really to apportion blame. It's really to establish, I guess, how that person died. And from that, if there is, say, foul play, someone died in a police cell, for example, that can be taken, further by the justice system. But essentially, it's to establish how someone died. And so when someone dies abroad, an inquest is only held if remains are repatriated back to the UK. And because my brother had some remains identified in 2002 and 2004, he was one of a total, actually, coincidentally, 10 people who had their remains identified that had been repatriated back to the UK. So rather than having what would be normally an individual inquest, in a coroner's court, there was 10 individual inquests in a kind of joint inquiry. Rather bizarrely, all those inquests were adjourned in 2004, and which is normal. The coroner normally allows for a little bit extra time to get more evidence, whatever's necessary. But it's quite astonishing that it didn't actually hold the inquest until January 2013. Some 9 years later from when they first opened the inquest. So anyway, the inquests were held into 10 individuals. They had, I think they were just spread across the two towers. Only 2 family members representing the victims actually attended the inquest. Our family didn't. At this stage, I wasn't in a good place to go and attend the inquest. And
you said your family did not? Is that what you said?
We did not attend, no. Only 2 representatives of the 10 victims actually turned up. I mean, it was such a long time afterwards. I mean, I know a lot of the family members in the UK and clearly just, they moved on or part the grief, so they didn't want to reopen stuff, so they didn't attend the inquest. I didn't attend it, but afterwards I did get hold of the audio from the coroner and the actual transcript, but it was all over in about an hour and 45, where they dealt generally what happened that day, which pretty much, I wouldn't say a cut and paste in the 9/11 Commission report, but it was pretty much the official narrative. And then they spent, it varied a couple of minutes to maybe 10 minutes per victim. My brother had about 3 minutes, just detailing, where he was born, just real factual stuff, and the remains that had been found. And they, the key thing that they concluded was, yes, it was death by, you guys call it blunt trauma. That gets translated into multiple injuries on an inquest. And so they basically said it was multiple injuries. And the official narrative that they applied in the conclusion was, it was hijackers, hijacking planes, crashing those planes into the towers, causing the towers collapse as part of a coordinated effort by Al Qaeda. So that the main thing that's really to do with the manner of death or how my brother died is essentially the building collapsing. You could argue it's possibly the plane going in that killed him, but it's the plane collapsing that ultimately has caused his death by multiple injuries. So I guess I should probably at some point fill in some history, but so we didn't attend, but there is a lot of evidence that through no fault of her own, the coroner was not at fault. If any fault lies, it's that those of the counterterrorism police and the police that obviously should have investigated the circumstances surrounding his death. The coroner basically just dealt with what she was presented in front of her. There was a report read out by a policeman who had a report written by a counterterrorism officer who worked for SO15, and off the back of that, she's made this judgment that the plane caused the collapse of the building. Mm-hmm. So what we're challenging, which is it's a bit of a weird process in the UK, but we do, and thankfully we do have this ability to challenge the finding of a coroner's court.
Can you back up just a second? So You're saying at this point now you're saying you're reopening the case?
No.
So the challenge was before that?
No. So the inquest has been done. That's been finished. The first one. So what we're doing now, there's a mechanism whereby the Attorney General, who's like the highest appointed, not legal person, and that's the Lord Justice, but basically, I guess, representing government, who is a lawyer, a barrister, they have the power to grant what's called the authority, so to reopen an inquest. And so what we're preparing is basically a pile of evidence that wasn't considered at the first inquest, show that there was a lack of inquiry as well. You basically put your case on paper to the Attorney General, and should there be a chance that the verdict may change, and certainly if there's a lot of evidence, we're well over that kind of minimum level that's needed, the Attorney General should grant her authority to then push it up to what we have called a High Court in the UK. And at the High Court, they then make a ruling as well, looking at the same pack that we prepared. And hopefully, because I don't think we found one instance where they've not followed what the Attorney General has recommended, i.e. grant your authority, let's reopen the case. The High Court should push it to the Coroner's Court to say, right, we need to quash the original inquest and open a fresh one. And so the legal step we're taking right now is having a barrister in the UK prepare an application that's going to be submitted to the Attorney General. And that's a mixture of eyewitness statements, expert testimony statements, victim family statements, and obviously the actual body of the application that the barrister's preparing. And I said, all things being equal and measured, we're well over the bar of what would be required under normal circumstances, I believe, for a barrister, for a Attorney General to go, yes, I will grant my authority. There's definitely new evidence that may change the verdict. Yes, there's definitely insufficiency in inquiry at the original inquest. I grant my authority to push this up to the High Court for them in turn to reopen the actual inquest in a fresh court, in a coroner's court. So that's where I'm at right now. And we are within weeks of actually getting the application ready to submit. It's taken longer than we thought, but like most things, it's always takes longer than you think. But yeah, so that's where we're at right now. And I mean, I can take a pause here now, David. I can go into a bit more about the inquest. What do you think?
Well, whichever way you feel like doing.
Let me get the inquest stuff out of the way. So
okay.
Let's assume. So let's just say end of this month or beginning of April, we submit the petition to the Attorney General. Typically, within 3 to 6 months, maybe 9, she will make a decision. And I said, we're very confident that it will be, yep, we grant authority to push it up to the High Court. In turn, the High Court, anything from 3 to 6 to 9 months to make a decision. Yes, we need to quash the original inquest, reopen it in a coroner's court, and then depending on the scheduling of the coroner's court, whenever that occurs. So, we could be looking potentially at being in a coroner's court within a year if things move quickly and smoothly. Otherwise, it could be a couple of years. We don't know really. And obviously, the key thing right now, the first hurdle, is get the authority from the Attorney General. That's absolutely critical because we only have one shot at this.
How hopeful are you that justice will prevail, or if this is going to be a rigged situation?
I mean, there's the big thing of justice will prevail. I mean, so at the moment we're just trying to get it into court, yeah. So right. We're not even at that stage yet, yeah. So
that's what I'm just saying. In other words, to get it into court, somebody has to agree to do that. Yes,
I'm confident of that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I said, it's not. I mean, to give you an idea, and I talked about this, I think 2-3 years ago, or 2.5 years ago, when on one of the anniversaries, I came out to the States and spoke in Manhattan and spoke out in Washington. Big cover-ups and lack of justice can be overturned. I'm not saying our country's any better than any other, but I mean it can happen. So the one I quoted was Bloody Sunday, if you're familiar with that, and the young Irish people who were innocent, who were murdered by British servicemen back in, I think it was 72. And that was covered up on the day by, I think he was a major, went around making a fictitious list. Even kids who were like 14 saying, or 15, saying that they were bombers and nail bombers and whatever their role was, whatever, the person's name and what they said they were suspected of. And then the very next day, our Prime Minister and the Lord Chief Justice, Widgery, basically a memo was discovered about 25, 30 years later that basically, I think was from the Prime Minister, essentially saying, oh God, I can't remember the exact wording, but it was, I don't want to misquote it, but it was just essentially, do your job for Britain. This needs to be sorted and fixed. And it was just not, it was absolutely an inappropriate thing for the Prime Minister to have written on a note to the Lord Justice. And anyway, fast forward, 20 years, the families got together. They'd obviously been protesting the innocence of the people that on a peaceful march basically had been shot. And then about 7 or 8 years later, they went through the same process that we're going through now. And the original inquiry and the individual inquests were quashed. And I think it was probably 2009, I can't remember, something like that sort of time. So talking a long time on from the original killings. It basically, they said it was, the actions of the British soldiers were both unjustified and they were unjustified in other behaviour that they did that day. But the point I'm trying to make is that was covered up at the highest level. I mean, the major who was in charge of the soldiers who did the killing ended up being head of the British Army, about 30 years later, which is still astonishing to me that, you would have thought that that wouldn't be the case for someone who clearly was part of that cover-up. So I'm not saying we're going to get lucky. I know, for Bloody Sunday, it was, I think it was the political climate at the time helped. And there was a great push to get the Good Friday Agreement signed. And, there was a lot of support and pressure, I think, to do the right thing by the Bloody Sunday families. I'm not so sure we have that political sort of support right now. I mean, I know I've tried to get support of my local MP, but unfortunately he's not going to support me. But I have to be hopeful that just using that same mechanism, it should work. And I said, we've got way over what would normally be required to get the authority from the Attorney General, in my opinion. There's a lot of evidence that just simply was not put in front of the Attorney General. It's not. So
this is potentially
Sorry.
This is potentially yet another way to get a foot in the door.
Absolutely. I mean, I started thinking about this in probably 2013, 2014 for sure. And I've always felt that this is probably the easiest, quickest way to get. Obviously, 9/11 is a big story. There's lots of things that aren't right, and there's anomalies left, right, and centre in the official narrative. But very specifically, to get evidence of explosives, it's the best vehicle, I think. Even though it's not in the US, it's in the UK. For the simple reason, it's kind of almost like our inquests are tailor-made for the cause of death being explosives, because the scope of an inquest is really narrow. It's basically, how did that person come about their death?
Mm-hmm.
You're not talking about who did it. It's irrelevant for the purposes. It's really looking at the evidence of how they died.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there is a lot of evidence out there. And so it's kind of, and obviously work over the years by lots of people, be it, architects, engineers, obviously yourself, David, and just, everyone who supported that effort. There is a lot of evidence out there. And so it in my mind, it was like, wow, this could be really an easy way of getting this evidence into court. Yes, it does cost money, but I mean, I don't think, in the big scheme of things, it's not crazy money. I always had, a dream that, maybe there'd be some justice served in the US, but I just think it's so hard. I couldn't imagine. I can't conceptualize ever getting into court. Even when it came down to the victim compensation fund and people trying to sue, it's just such a long, drawn out process. I've only got to look at the two Saudi suits, the Kreindler and Motley Rice suits. My dad's part of the Motley Rice lawsuit. That's still not going anywhere. And I think they started that in 2002. When I say not going anywhere, it's slow, painful progress. And that's how I've always seen the legal process in the States as just being painful. Whereas this, to me, was always going to be, it's not risky. We've got one shot at it, but I think our odds are in our favour for sure.
Good. I just want to say I was brought into this a little bit because I was one of the people asked to be an expert witness. And I just want to say, dealing back and forth with your attorney has been a remarkable experience. He's very sharp. And I feel very hopeful that, you got a good guy handling this for you. So he went back and forth with me on my statement, honing everything in terms of the legal angle, whereas I'm more looking at it from the physics explanatory angle. But he really knew how to take what I had to say and hone it down to what he could work with. So I was very impressed.
It's been a very interesting process. Obviously, we have a number of experts. We have, I said, eyewitness statements as well, and just it's all about language. Essentially, we're trying to put forward a case of something that obviously has its complexities, but it really needs to be understandable for the layman. Even though the Attorney General will have access to technical resources, it still needs to read with as little technical jargon in there as possible.
Mm.
He's very thorough. I had a friend who went into law, probably about 10 years ago. And I actually asked her for a couple of law chambers in the UK that she thought might be suitable when I first approached the idea, this idea of trying to reopen the inquest. And he was, I think, either the first or the second chap that I made contact with. And I just liked him. His profile is kind of interesting. He's done a lot of tricky cases, let's just put it that way. I think he advised or helped one of the Princess Diana's eyewitnesses just to help prepare what she needed to do. I think he had a fairly small role in that, but he's more recently, and he's still involved in a high-profile paedophile case with Lord Janner. He's dead now, but that's still going on with all the victims coming forward. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff that he's got involved in. I quite like his profile as a barrister. He's not afraid to go and tackle these kind of cases. But yeah, I actually made contact with him back in 2016, probably. And it was just an exploratory kind of, okay, what do I need to do to bring this about? And, very quickly, I think I'd raised about probably $5,000, but it was like, oh my God, I'm going to need an awful lot more than that. And, it was just, I already saw the amount of work that was involved and the experts would need to get. And yeah, I mean, we ended up through architects and engineers and obviously their donors, raising, the necessary funds, about $100,000 to engage the barrister in the UK to get us to this position where we're about to submit the petition. Submitting the petition sounds so weak. I mean, it's not. It's going to be a 2,000 plus page submission. It's not something you just signed and booted on. But yeah, I mean, he I must admit, David, I'd say out of all the expert statements, I think he probably found yours the easiest. You can tell you've been a teacher. You're very clear with your explanations.
That's what I do. Anyway, I wanted to shift gears a little bit. There was some things we talked about earlier that I thought were rather illuminating. And one of them is, could you talk a little bit about, like you said, your brother had some remains that were found. And where exactly was he? Where were the remains found and what condition were they in? Like that really, I think it tells a lot just by going into that question.
Yeah, if I just do a little bit of chronology, just because it'll be in my brain easy that way. So we had a collarbone first identified in 2002. I think it was either the day before or on my mum's.
Was that an entire collarbone?
No, just a fragment of it. The significance of that was really important for my mum. When he was a baby, I think my mum and dad had taken us up to Scotland on a sleeper train, and we were in kind of bunks or something. And anyway, cut long story short, on the way back from Scotland, Geoff somehow rolled out of the bunk and landed on the floor. And he used to cry a lot as a baby. And I guess mum and dad didn't really think much of it, but then the crying really, really wouldn't stop. And anyway, they found out that he'd actually broken his collarbone. And so mum took tremendous significance out of that being the first remains that were identified and returned to us that it was his collarbone. And so it might sound a bit weird, but basically those remains sat in the little box that had been sent over in my house for a couple of years because we didn't really know what to do with it, to be honest. We haven't really talked about.
So that was sent back to England then?
Yes, yeah. And then 2 years later, we had 3 more bone fragments. One was slightly larger. It was Jeff's femur, which is obviously a tough old bone. And so we had 4 bones, and a decision then was made to bury him. So I think, late, it might have actually been on the anniversary. I really can't remember, but sort of August, September timeframe, 2004, we had our first proper burial. We'd had a memorial wake, whatever you want to call it, sort of 10 days afterwards in 2001, but this is the first sort of funeral. And then really, that was it. And then out of the blue, some more remains were found identified, I should say, in 2008. And this kind of threw us a lot because it was kind of tissue rather than bones. So a bit of his hair, well, his scalp, his face, jaw, and just things like that.
And was this at the landfill?
Yes. So sorry, I should say. So only two. No, that sorry. So the bones that I just mentioned, yeah, they were all found at landfill, the fresh kills, whatever the dumping ground was called. The remains that were identified in 2008 were found on site, on World Trade Center site, but we didn't have a location. The FDNY didn't tag, didn't locate everything. Every remain was tagged with a unique number, but not all the locations were noted, either manually or with a GPS gadget that a lot of the fire people and other people searching for remains had. And so, anyway, so we had a second burial, and then out of the blue in 2013, I think it was like end of May, early June, we got another call from the police saying that another part of Geoff had been found. And this was his humerus, top part of his arm. And that is the only piece that still is sitting in the repository in the museum. We haven't had that
in New York.
In New York, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, it's so to give you an idea of I sort of tried to estimate it. We've got about 3% of my brother's remains, which, I mean, we're kind of lucky. There's still 1,108 people who haven't had anything identified at World Trade. 40% of all the victims haven't had anything identified. So, I mean, on that point, I've spent far too much time, whether it be researching stuff or emailing or speaking to people from the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, the people who deal with the identification and collection of remains and stuff. But Amy Mundorf, who was one of the key people in the early days, who was part of that identification process. I mean, I think, if I remember rightly, she actually went down there on the morning of 9/11 and she got injured, was concussed by one of the collapsing towers. The first one, I presume it would have been. But she went back to work, I think, the next day or the day after. And I've had lots of conversations with either current or ex OCME staff. But I know Amy Mundorf, the reason why I quote her is she's on record as saying that 5,000 of the 22,000 odd remains are no bigger than an inch. You're talking about, incredible degree of fragmentation of remains.
Well, that was the point. Like you said, I believe that like you said, the humerus, and you said a femur, is that right?
Yeah, femur, yeah.
And then the collarbone. And all of these you said were just an inch or two or so. Is that about?
I mean, they're very, very small. I mean, nothing's more than the femur, maybe three and a bit inches, 4 inches, but everything else is between an inch and 2 inches.
Yeah.
They're small.
So in other words, it would basically it's something to ponder of what would it take to reduce a person to fragments of that size. And so anyway, that's
I mean, well, what's interesting I find is the of the 10 victims that this is quoting from the stuff that came out in the inquest, yeah, and I can't say people's names because I'm not supposed to divulge stuff within that inquest, but
sure,
there were 10 victims who died from being at the 106th floor, the Brisk Waters Conference. 3 of those people, including my brother, had 2-3%, so tiny bone fragments, that kind of thing. One man had about 86% of his body was
from the same location.
On the same location. And I mean, yeah, I won't go into, but I mean, the father was very shocked, and you can hear him, the concern in his voice. He couldn't get his head round when the coroner was reading this out. I mean, he obviously knew because he'd identified his son, but it was the first time I think he was hearing that there was such small remains of other people being found, because everyone in that inquest basically, because they both died in the two towers, had fragments. No one really had the complete body apart from his son. And yeah, one of the things that I have done over the years is, apart from contacting everyone I can think of, is I have been emailing and, you know, I guess a little bit of conversation with forensic pathologists. The main reason being is, and I'll quote it, I stumbled across this book. I can't remember what the name of it is. It's something like Pathology of Explosive Victims. I don't know, something like that. But there was a pathologist called James Ferris, who basically writes about the key thing with explosives and remains is proximity to them. And he's actually quoting this book as saying, total disintegration and disruption of the entire body not only indicates extreme forces, but that the victim was in close proximity to the device at the time of detonation. And it got me, you know, just obviously wondering about this man who's, you know, nearly whole, and yet most victims on that floor seem to be, you know, small fragments, all they've managed to recover. And it does make me wonder about, you know, proximity to explosives, and clearly I believe that my brother was close.
So just a matter of where they were within the room had a big difference in terms of. So
yes, I mean it's tricky though. To be fair, David, I mean the people that who, you know, engage me, I had quite a good few responses from people. It's not a perfect science. There's lots of things that can affect the degree of disintegration of bodies, and that bit furniture, other people in the way, etc. So it's not easy to really state that, but it was just the fact that was a matter of fact from, you know, and I guess like many people, it's not just obviously terrorist attacks. They've looked at a lot of these forensic pathologists who have experience with explosions are looking at people in wars, etc. You know, there's a lot of evidence that they're drawing on. But it was just what really got me was the total disintegration and disruption. And so go back to the fact that 40% of the victims have nothing. There's been nothing identified of them. 1,108 people have not had anything identified. And obviously how that affects all the families, you know, is hard to think about.
Right.
You know, we're lucky because we've, you know, my brother's been identified. We're not sitting there pondering, you know, stuff. But yeah, it's, and then, you know, you take it a step further. You look at, so sorry, David, to go back to your original question. So yes, the remains that the humerus that was found in 2013, it didn't have a GPS location, but it had a grid location. And so the FDNY basically overlaid this is where it would be good to have a presentation, had a map of the World Trade Center area, and they basically divided the area up into a grid, and each grid was, I wouldn't say 20 meters by 20 meters, but approaching that. And so the only remains that were actually tagged with the location were actually these final remains. And they were found or located in a grid location called K12, which was about 18 to 41 meters south of the south side of the North Tower. So it's outside the footprint, but, you know, we're not talking miles away, yeah? You know,
well, for reference, basically the diameter, the side length of the towers was 64 meters. So if they're 80 meters, it's just picture the, you know, the width of the tower plus a little bit beyond the wall.
Yeah, maximum 40 meters away from the south side is where the most southern part of the grid locations of K12. But But then we look, at the various maps that exist of the location of all the remains that were found, and it makes up for a truly astonishing picture. And I'm sorry, I should have it to hand. It is actually one of the things that's going to be submitted in the inquest petition. And it's a huge area. You've got remains some 200 meters away from the footprints of the towers. And whilst it's hard to get into the exact science of explosives dismembering and disintegrating bodies, clearly something is propelling these remains incredible distances outside of the footprints of the towers.
Right.
But yeah, so I mean,
I just wanted all that to come out, because actually, from a physical investigation, that tells us something about the nature of the event. That it could, I mean, the idea of fragmenting, if you just think your bones are pretty well protected by all your flesh, and so to have something that would fragment your bones so small and be able to separate them and propel them and so forth, you're really looking at a high explosive. And so even though, for instance, nanothermite has been identified, that's not usually seen as such a high explosive. Usually it's a shock wave that does this kind of breaking things into small pieces and stuff. So I just, it's one way, it's one window into looking at what kind of an event this was. So thank you.